We are going to study qualitative analysis. Now, what is qualitative analysis? It is the series of tests which we perform in order to identify which cations or anions are present in our compound. So it's basically a practical topic and we carry it out in labs. Most of the आप देखोगे cations के test different होते हैं, anions के test different होते हैं, and these tests are performed in the lab, and with the help of these tests you recognize which ion is present in your salt or compound. Reagents: aqueous sodium hydroxide and aqueous ammonia. Both of these alkalis are used to test for cations. Most of the metal ions make precipitate when reacted with these alkalis, except alkali metals ions and ammonium ions, जिनके hydroxide soluble होते हैं. बाकी सारे metal hydroxides आपको पता है insoluble होते हैं. So when you add either sodium hydroxide or aqueous ammonia to a salt solution, metal hydroxide precipitate is seen. By the color of the precipitate and by its solubility, we can recognize the metal ion present in the salt, the cation of the salt. And if a gas is released by adding alkali, sodium hydroxide, ammonia gas is released, then we can also confirm that ammonium ion is present, right? Because only ammonium salts, if you remember, react with alkalis to produce ammonia gas. As I told you before, that in order to check for cation, we react the salt solution with either sodium hydroxide and aqueous ammonia. First, we'll test it with sodium hydroxide, then we test it with aqueous ammonia. Now, the mode of operation is that first you add few drops of the alkali to the salt solution to see if a precipitate is produced, to check the color of the precipitate. Then we add excess of the alkali to the salt solution to see the solubility of the precipitate, whether the precipitate is soluble or insoluble. So always, first step may we add few drops of the alkali, second step may we add excess of alkali, and we explain the solubility of the precipitate. And by the color and the solubility, we can conclude which ion can be present. Every ion has a different color precipitate and a different type of solubility in excess of alkali. Let's see. The first test we perform is for zinc ion. Now zinc salt, if the salt contains zinc ion and if we add few drops of sodium hydroxide to it, then white precipitate of zinc hydroxide is produced. This precipitate is of zinc hydroxide. Remember, ये जो precipitate बन रहे हैं, ये metal hydroxide के बन रहे हैं. White precipitate is produced. Now we add excess of alkali and shake the tube well. If the precipitate dissolve in excess of alkali, then it could be zinc or even aluminium. As you will see, aluminium ion also make white precipitate with sodium hydroxide, and their precipitate also dissolve in excess of sodium hydroxide to make a colorless solution. When precipitate dissolve, then you have to tell the color of the solution as well. Okay. Then we perform the same test with aqueous ammonia. First, we will take a salt solution of zinc salt, the salt which we think is a zinc salt, and we add few drops of aqueous ammonia to it. White precipitate is produced. Again, both zinc and aluminium ion forms white precipitate with aqueous ammonia. So we are still not sure which ion is it. It could be zinc hydroxide or it could be aluminium hydroxide. Now you add excess of aqueous ammonia to check whether the precipitate is soluble or not. The zinc hydroxide precipitate dissolves in excess of aqueous ammonia to form a colorless solution. Now this confirms that ये जो precipitate था, that was of zinc hydroxide and zinc ions are present in the solution, because only the white precipitate of zinc is soluble in aqueous ammonia. Aluminium hydroxide precipitate is not soluble in aqueous ammonia. Okay, so let's see. Now let's see the test for aluminium ion. Aluminium ion में जब हम sodium hydroxide के few drops डालेंगे, again the same white precipitate, is seen, and the precipitate dissolves in excess of sodium hydroxide. So you see, the results are same. Zinc and aluminium ion both form white precipitate with sodium hydroxide, and in both the cases the white precipitate dissolves in excess of sodium hydroxide to form a colorless solution. So zinc and aluminium ion cannot be differentiated by sodium hydroxide. In order to differentiate the precipitates of zinc and aluminium, we perform the second test, aqueous ammonia test. For zinc, हमने देखा white precipitate बना aqueous ammonia में, and the precipitate dissolves to form a colorless solution. But aluminium, if aluminium ions are present in the salt solution, then aluminium ions also form white precipitate with aqueous ammonia, but this time when you add excess of aqueous ammonia, the white precipitate remains in the solution. The white precipitate is insoluble in excess of aqueous ammonia. So this is how we differentiate between zinc ion and the aluminium ion through the aqueous ammonia test. Remember, this is very important because सोडियम हाइड्रोक्साइड टेस्ट से आप जिंक और एल्यूमिनियम में डिफरेंशिएट नहीं कर सकते. Only white precipitate of zinc is soluble in both sodium hydroxide and aqueous ammonia. Aluminium precipitate is soluble in sodium hydroxide, but it is insoluble in aqueous ammonia. Remember this. And why do these precipitate dissolve in aqueous ammonia? You know, zinc oxide, zinc hydroxide and aluminium hydroxide both are amphoteric. That's why they are dissolving in alkalis. Okay. Let's see the test of sodium hydroxide and aqueous ammonia for calcium ion. Okay. So when you add few drops of sodium hydroxide to your salt solution, and if a white precipitate is produced, now this white precipitate could be due to aluminium ion, it could be due to zinc ion, it could be due to calcium ion. तीनों की वजह से white precipitate बन सकता है. When you add excess of sodium hydroxide and the precipitate remains insoluble, it means calcium ions are present, because both aluminium ion and zinc ion are soluble in excess of sodium hydroxide, as you have seen in the previous slide. So remember, so with sodium hydroxide we can easily differentiate calcium ion from zinc and aluminium ion. Then we perform the test of aqueous ammonia with calcium ion as well. Calcium ion do not react with aqueous ammonia, so no reaction is seen if you add aqueous ammonia to a salt solution containing calcium ions. So this further confirms that calcium ions are present. There is no reaction of calcium ion with aqueous ammonia, remember. Now come the colored precipitate. Transition metal ions, copper ions, iron 3, iron 2, chromium, these make colored precipitate. Calcium, aluminium, zinc तो white precipitate बनाते थे ना, उनकी differentiation test हमने पढ़ लिए sodium hydroxide और aqueous ammonia से. Now let's see how the transition metal behave with these alkalis. First, the test for copper 2 ions. पहली indication copper 2 ions की color of the solution होती है. Most of the copper salts are blue in color. So if your salt solution is blue in color, it may contain copper ion, right? So when you add sodium hydroxide few drops to your salt solution and a light blue precipitate is produced, this shows that copper ions may be present, but we have to prove it. When you add excess of sodium hydroxide, the light blue precipitate remains insoluble. Remember, copper precipitate, copper hydroxide precipitate is insoluble in excess of sodium hydroxide. Now you perform the second test, the aqueous ammonia test. So we add a few drops of aqueous ammonia to your salt solution. If copper ions are present, again we'll get a light blue precipitate. But now if you add excess of aqueous ammonia and shake, the light blue precipitate will dissolve to make a dark blue solution or a deep blue solution. So a drastic color change occurs. This confirms that copper ions are present. Now this test is very important. It comes often in the paper. Okay, aqueous ammonia mein how does if you are adding aqueous ammonia, excess of aqueous ammonia to copper salt, what do you see? First, we will see a light blue precipitate which dissolves in excess of aqueous ammonia to form a dark blue solution or a deep blue solution. Remember, this is very important. Okay, iron 2. Now, iron 2 salts are generally pale green. Iron 2 salt solution भी pale green होते हैं. But when you add few drops of sodium hydroxide to a salt solution containing iron 2 ion, we will see a green precipitate. Green precipitate is seen, and the precipitate remains insoluble in excess of sodium hydroxide. Similarly, it forms green precipitate with aqueous ammonia which remains insoluble in excess of aqueous ammonia. Iron के precipitate याद रखें, they are insoluble in both sodium hydroxide and aqueous ammonia. Iron 2 के भी, iron 3 के भी. So this precipitate is basically iron 2 hydroxide. ये जितने भी precipitate बन रहे हैं, ये metal hydroxide के बन रहे हैं. Remember this. Okay, now let's see iron 3 ion. How do these behave? Iron 3 ions, when it reacted with few drops of sodium hydroxide, it forms a red-brown precipitate or reddish-brown precipitate. And the precipitate remains insoluble in excess of sodium hydroxide, and the precipitate remains insoluble in excess of aqueous ammonia as well. It also forms a reddish-brown precipitate with aqueous ammonia. Another interesting thing which I want to tell you, कि when iron 2 precipitate जो कि green होता है, when it is allowed to stand for some time, its color changes to red-brown. Why? Because while standing in air, iron 2 ions are oxidized to iron 3 ions. So वो color iron 2 से green से red-brown हो जाता है after some time. Ammonium ion. Now, ammonium ion does not make any precipitate with sodium hydroxide because ammonium hydroxide is soluble. But it's a property of ammonium compound that when an alkali is added to these and these are warm, they produce ammonia gas. So if in ammonium salt you add sodium hydroxide, no precipitate is seen. But if you warm the reaction mixture, you will see bubbles of a colorless pungent gas that turns moist red litmus paper blue. So bubbles of a colorless gas you will see. Which gas is it? Ammonia gas. वो आप बाद में बताओगे, पहले आप उसकी observation बताओगे. So remember कि when you add sodium hydroxide to your salt solution and no precipitate is seen, then we heat this mixture to check whether ammonia is given off or not. If bubbles of a colorless pungent gas are seen, which turns damp red litmus blue, it means ammonia is being released and ammonium ion is present. If the gas is not produced, it means it's not present. With aqueous ammonia, ammonium salts don't react. The last test is with chromium ions. Now chromium salts are also green in color, but ये darker green होते हैं iron 2 salts से. And chromium ion also form a green precipitate when few drops of sodium hydroxides are added to it. So how to differentiate between iron 2 ion and chromium ion? Both are forming green precipitate with sodium hydroxide. The difference is when you add excess of sodium hydroxide, the chromium hydroxide precipitate dissolves to form a clear green solution, whereas iron 2 precipitate अगर आपको याद हो उसका green precipitate insoluble था excess of sodium hydroxide में. So this is the point of difference between chromium ion and iron 2 ion. In excess of sodium hydroxide, green precipitate of chromium hydroxide is soluble. It forms a green solution. With aqueous ammonia, chromium also forms green precipitate which remains insoluble, just like iron 2 precipitate. But aqueous ammonia से हम इन दोनों में sodium hydroxide से हम इन दोनों में differentiate कर सकते हैं.